Today's lesson will be about amphibians. Now, your book takes this and breaks it into two sections, but for the sake of time, we're going to combine it together. We're going to talk about frogs and all other amphibians at the same time. So our new modified, improved objectives are to explain how amphibians breathe, to describe amphibian metamorphosis. We've talked about it with insects. Look for comparisons between the two. Describe the three groups of amphibians, giving an example of each one. And I'd like you to try explaining why amphibians are considered ecological indicators. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So amphibians are able to live in the water, but they also have some really important organs that allow them to be successful on land as well. Namely, they have lungs and they have legs. Scientists see some commonalities between the lungfish-like fish that we talked about on Wednesday and the amphibians that we're going to talk about today. And remember that we said that when scientists see common ground between two species, they start to assume that those two species are more closely related than others. And so if you were an evolutionary biologist, you might take that a step further and say these two species must have evolved from each other. They must be close together on the evolutionary tree. Lungs are respiratory organs that allow air to be exchanged, so oxygen to come into the body and that waste product from cellular respiration, carbon dioxide, to leave the body. They're an important component to the amphibian body. Fossils show that early amphibians, predecessors to the ones that we see running around today, had some characteristics that were more like a fish and some that perhaps were more like a modern-day salamander. These guys had some other adaptations we don't see today that made them even more successful on land. For one thing, they were much larger. They were up to 10 meters long, and they could live out of the water for a longer period of time. We'll talk about why in a little bit. Scientists believe that earlier amphibians had to return to the water really only when they were ready to mate and lay eggs. The word amphibian itself means double life, and the reason for that is because most amphibians live part of their life in the water and part of their life on land. Typically, the beginning of an amphibian's life is lived in the water, and then as they grow and undergo that process called metamorphosis, they develop the characteristics to be able to live successfully on land. And so most amphibians spend their adult life on land. A couple of other characteristics that amphibians all have in common: they lay eggs that lack a shell or a skin, and this is to prevent water loss. And they're all ectotherms as well, which remember means that they can't necessarily maintain a stable internal temperature on their own. Living in water is an advantage to an ectotherm because water doesn't change temperature as radically as the air does. Think about living by Lake Michigan. The lake takes a really long time to get warm, and then it kind of stays warm longer than the atmosphere. That's why places like Chicago tend to be warmer in the late fall than other places. But then once they finally do cool down, which takes a really long time, then areas like Chicago, right on Lake Michigan, tend to be cooler than the surrounding areas because that lake hasn't had a chance to warm up yet. Water changes temperature more slowly, and that makes it a more stable environment for an ectotherm like an amphibian. Amphibians have very neat skin as well. Their skin is smooth and moist, there's that fun word, and thin. Emphasis on thin. It's so thin, in fact, that amphibians are able to actually absorb water through their skin instead of having to drink it. This can cause dehydration in amphibians pretty quickly if they're not in a wet and fully water-saturated environment. This is part of the reason why today's amphibians don't tend to stray too far from a water source. Scientists think that earlier amphibians had actually a thicker skin, and so that was why they were able to live away from water a little more effectively. Amphibians are able to breathe through their skin as well. They absorb oxygen through the air more often than they necessarily have to use their lungs. It's sort of a backup plan, you can think of it that way. Amphibian skin tends to be brightly colored because oftentimes amphibians have poison glands built into their skin, and so the bright color warns predators. The poisons can range from being just semi-irritating when they get on you to actually being deadly. After hatching, a frog or a toad becomes a tadpole. Now we all probably can close our eyes and picture a tadpole. It's a fish-shaped larvae, and it has to live in water. It gets its oxygen not through lungs at this point, but through gills. And then over time, those tadpoles will lose their gills and they will develop structures like legs and lungs that allow them to be successful out of the water. That's a pretty dramatic change, right? Gaining whole organs and organ systems as they're already out in the world exploring. We call a change that dramatic metamorphosis. It's a phase in life where animals make rapid changes from immature to adult. There are a few amphibians that are exceptions to these rules. Some of them don't go through complete metamorphosis like we just described. They go through a version called incomplete metamorphosis, which you might remember from our conversation about insects, arthropods. Some of them are going to hatch as tiny versions of themselves. The only real exception here is that the tiny versions will still have gills. There are even some amphibians that develop on land in really, really wet places. The Darwin frog, for instance, lays its eggs on wet ground, so wet land, and then the embryos begin to move. As an adult, the male puts them inside of his vocal sac, and then when they're finished developing, those young just jump out of the mouth. Here you see the amphibian metamorphosis process. We have fertilized eggs to start. Then there are the newly hatched tadpoles that feed on a yolk stored in their body. They use gills to breathe. And then this is sort of the funky in-between that we don't see a lot of. This is the tadpole as it's beginning to change. It's undergoing metamorphosis, not in a cocoon like we might see with an insect, but now out in the open, gaining legs, developing lungs. Once those features have completely developed, as the tail is disappearing and those legs and lungs are becoming functional, then the frog in its pre-adult phase begins to come out of the water. When it's fully an adult, then it's able to survive successfully on land. There are more than 5,400 species of amphibians alive today, and they can be broken into three major groups. We have caecilians, which maybe you don't know that much about, kind of interesting, salamanders, and frogs and toads. Caecilians. Scientists have discovered more than 160 species of these guys. They live in tropical areas like Asia, Africa, and South America. It's part of the reason we don't see a lot of them. They look sort of like earthworms or snakes, but they have that neat amphibian skin that's thin and can absorb water and oxygen and all sorts of other good stuff. Unlike other amphibians, though, they don't have legs. Some of them have bony scales on their skin that sort of give them that extra abrasion, but they don't oftentimes look like amphibians in other ways. This video on the screen is a little creepy. I'm going to post it on my website so you can watch it if you would like. Salamanders, the second group of amphibians. Scientists have discovered more than 500 species of these guys. Adults oftentimes live under stones or logs in the woods. They are considered to be among the oldest amphibians. They don't develop as tadpoles. They actually go through a process more like incomplete metamorphosis. Most of them are going to lose their gills and grow lungs during development. There are a few, though, that never lose their gills, like the axolotls. They're going to live in water their entire life. And so I have a video here that I will again post on my website that shows a little bit more about these salamanders. Frogs and toads, the third and final category of amphibians. These guys make up about 90% of all of the amphibians on the earth. They are sort of similar, but they are different from one another as well. So I'm going to post this video that explains the differences between a frog and a toad. Technically, a toad is a type of frog, so it's like an even more specific type of organism. Frogs and toads live all over the world, except in places that are very, very cold because they're ectotherms and can't make their own heat. They're highly adapted for life on land. They have well-developed muscles for jumping, well-developed ears for hearing, vocal cords for calling out mating calls and predator calls, and long, sticky tongues that they can use to catch prey, usually insects. Frogs produce sound by forcing air from their lungs across vocal cords, just like you and I. It happens in the throat region, again, just like humans. That area is called the vocal sac, and it's surrounded by a thin wall of skin, and the vocal sac is sort of like putting your cell phone into a cup or a bowl. It amplifies sound. It gives that sound a place to reverberate before it comes out. Frogs use this ability to sing through vocal sac to attract mates and to mark territories. It can be, or the singing is an instinctual thing. It means that they don't have to learn it. They can do it. And some frogs are even able to change pitches when they sing. So here's a video that I will post on my website that tells you a little bit more about this idea of singing frogs. And then lastly, this is our final objective for this section as well. Amphibians are considered to be ecological indicators. That means that they serve as an early sign of change in an ecosystem. When a large number of amphibians begin to die or show deformities, it shows that there's a problem in an ecosystem. This is because amphibians have super sensitive skin, and their skin is able to absorb chemicals that are floating around in the water or existing in the air. Climate change is also going to affect them greatly because they're ectotherms and they're not going to be able to survive changes in temperature in addition to those changes in environment. And that is your section on amphibians. The homework for Monday is to diagram a frog just like you diagrammed the fish for today. Please see the homework form on my website for directions on what to include in your diagram. Take a second to read through the remember and let me know if you have any questions.